It was exactly 3:14 in the morning when Emily Carter realized that time had quietly run out on the life she had been trying to hold together. And in that still, fragile hour before dawn, she sat on the edge of a worn mattress in her small apartment on the outskirts of Columbus, Ohio, staring at a final eviction notice that felt less like a warning and more like a sentence already decided. Because this wasn't the first notice she had received, it was simply the last one, the one that meant there would be no extensions, no second chances, no quiet understanding from a landlord who had already given more time than he could afford. And across the room, her daughter Sophie slept curled beneath a thin blanket, holding onto a faded teddy bear as if it could protect her from a reality she did not yet understand. And Emily watched her for a long moment, memorizing the calm expression on her face, because she knew that by the time Sophie woke up, everything could be different, and the place that had been their home might already be slipping away. The room was quiet in a way that made every thought feel louder. The hum of an old refrigerator in the corner, the occasional creak of the building settling into the night, and the faint glow of a laundromat sign outside casting shifting light through the window. And in that silence, Emily felt the full weight of everything she had been carrying for years, the long shifts, the missed meals, the constant balancing of bills that never seemed to stop coming, and the quiet fear that no matter how hard she worked, it would never quite be enough. And she lowered her gaze back to the paper in her hands, tracing the printed words as if there might be some detail she had missed, some hidden option that would change what it meant. But there was nothing new there, just the same final notice, the same date, the same reality that she could not delay any longer. And for the first time, she allowed herself to sit with the truth that she had run out of ways to fix this on her own. Her eyes drifted again towards Sophie, and she noticed the way her daughter's hand tightened slightly around the teddy bear, as if reacting to something in a dream, and Emily felt a sharp pull in her chest, because she knew that Sophie trusted her completely, trusted that she would always be there, always have an answer, always find a way. And that trust was both the most powerful thing in her life and the heaviest responsibility she had ever carried. And she stood up slowly, moving toward the small kitchen area, opening the cabinet door even though she already knew what was inside, or rather, what wasn't. And she stared at the nearly empty shelves, the few remaining items pushed to the back as if hiding them would somehow make them last longer. And she closed the cabinet gently, leaning her head against it for a moment, letting out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. Because this wasn't just about losing a home anymore. It was about reaching a point where she could no longer provide even the simplest things for her child. When she returned to the mattress, her movements felt slower, more deliberate, as if each step required more effort than the last, and her eyes landed on a small, crumpled flyer she had placed beside her earlier that day, something she had picked up almost without thinking while passing through a local community center, a place she rarely visited but had gone to out of a quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, there would be something there that could help. And the flyer had seemed insignificant at first, just another piece of paper among many. But now it stood out in a way it hadn't before, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment to matter. And she picked it up, smoothing out the creases as best she could, reading the words printed across it again. Emergency assistance line, followed by a number that she had not yet called, not because she didn't want to, but because calling it meant admitting something she had been trying to avoid, that she could not do this alone anymore. Her phone lay beside her, its screen cracked along one corner, the battery barely holding a charge, and when she picked it up, it flickered slightly before lighting up, casting a soft blue glow across her face, and she unlocked it slowly, her fingers hesitating over the keypad as she looked back and forth between the screen and the number on the flyer, committing each digit to memory as if the act of memorizing it would somehow make the call easier to make. And for a moment, she simply sat there, her thumb hovering over the first number, because this was more than just a call. It was a step she had resisted for as long as she could, a step that meant acknowledging that she needed help in a way she could no longer ignore. And she closed her eyes briefly, taking in a slow breath, before finally pressing the first digit. The sound of each number being dialed seemed louder than it should have been, echoing faintly in the quiet room. And as the final digit appeared on the screen, she paused again, her heart beginning to beat faster, not from fear exactly, but from the weight of what this call represented, because if this didn't work, there was nothing left to try, No other number to call, no other option to fall back on, and she pressed the call button, lifting the phone to her ear as she listened to the line. Connect, the first ring cutting through the silence with a sharp clarity that made her grip tighten slightly, and she waited, her breath shallow, her thoughts racing, as the phone rang again, each second stretching just enough to make her wonder if anyone would answer at all. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. Please subscribe to Story Nest so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. This story is only the beginning. The line clicked, and a voice came through, but it was not what she expected, not the warm, reassuring tone of someone trained to help, not the gentle introduction of a late-night operator ready to listen, but something entirely different, a voice that was calm, controlled, and precise, the kind of voice that did not carry uncertainty or hesitation, but authority, and it spoke immediately, without greeting, without introduction, asking a single question that made her entire body go still. Why did you call this number? And for a moment, Emily couldn't respond, because something about the way the question was asked felt wrong, not in a way she could easily explain, but in a way that made her instinctively aware that she had reached something she was never meant to reach. She pulled the phone slightly away from her ear, staring at the screen as if it might confirm what she was already beginning to suspect, that she had made a mistake, that she had dialed the wrong number, and she brought it back to her ear, her voice hesitant as she began to speak, trying to explain that she was looking for assistance, that she might have dialed incorrectly, but before she could finish, the voice interrupted her, not loudly, not abruptly, but with a certainty that immediately shifted the direction of the conversation. "You're late," it said, and the words settled into the silence in a way that made her heart skip, because they carried an expectation she did not understand, an assumption that she was someone else entirely. And as she tried again to explain, to correct the mistake, the voice continued, speaking as if her presence on the line had already been accounted for, describing a timeline, a task, and a level of urgency that made it clear this was no ordinary conversation. Emily sat frozen, listening as the man spoke about a package that needed to be moved before sunrise, about a location that would be provided once she confirmed she was ready, and about a payment that would follow once the task was complete. And when he mentioned the amount, her breath caught in her throat, because it was not just large, it was unimaginable, the kind of number that did not exist in her world, the kind that could change everything in an instant, and yet nothing about the situation felt simple or safe, because the way he spoke suggested something else entirely, something calculated, something planned, something that had nothing to do with helping someone in need, and everything to do with something she had accidentally become part of. And still, she did not hang up, because somewhere between fear and necessity, she understood that this moment, as strange and unsettling as it was, might be the only opportunity she would ever have to change the course of her life. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what happened next was not simply the continuation of a wrong call. It was the beginning of a connection that would reveal a history neither of them fully understood. And as Emily remained on the line, listening more carefully now, she began to realize that the man speaking to her was not just wealthy, he was powerful in a way that shaped outcomes far beyond individual lives. And the name he eventually gave, Richard Halston, carried weight even to someone like her, a name she had seen before in passing, attached to headlines about financial markets, corporate acquisitions, and influence that extended into places most people never saw. And yet in this moment, his voice carried something else as well, something quieter, something that suggested that whatever he was dealing with had reached a point where control was no longer absolute. As the conversation continued, Emily found herself asking questions she hadn't planned to ask, her voice steadier now, guided by a need to understand what she had stepped into. And when she mentioned the blue envelope he had referred to earlier, there was a pause on the line that felt different from the others, longer, more deliberate. And when he spoke again, his tone had shifted, not with suspicion, but with interest, asking her to describe what she could see around her. And as she did, explaining the apartment, the flickering light, the laundromat sign glowing through the window, something in his response changed, as if the details she provided did not match the expectations he had. And instead of ending the call, he asked another question, this time about the child he could hear in the background, and Emily answered without thinking, telling him about Sophie, about the eviction notice, about the situation she was facing. And in that moment, the conversation moved beyond its original purpose, becoming something neither of them had anticipated. What Emily could not have known was that the number she had dialed, though entered incorrectly, was not entirely disconnected from the life she was living, because decades earlier, that same line had been used for private communications tied to a place, a family, and a series of decisions that had never been fully resolved. And as Richard listened to her voice, to the details she shared, there was a familiarity he could not explain, something that did not align with the assumption that this was simply a stranger who had made a mistake. And instead of dismissing the situation, he made a decision that would alter both of their lives, offering her a task, one that required her to leave immediately and travel to a location he would provide, with the promise that if she completed it, the payment would be enough to change her circumstances permanently. And as Emily looked at her daughter, at the keys on the table, and at the life she was about to lose, she understood that whatever she chose next would define everything that followed. Emily stood there for a moment longer, the phone still pressed against her ear, her eyes fixed on the keys resting on the small table as if they carried the answer she was trying to find. And in that quiet space between fear and decision, she understood something with a clarity that surprised her, that staying where she was would not change anything, that the eviction notice would still be there in the morning, that the empty cabinets would not fill themselves, and that the life she was trying to protect was already slipping beyond her control. And so instead of asking more questions, instead of searching for reassurance that would never come, she told Richard Halston that she would go. And the moment the words left her mouth, everything seemed to shift, as if the path ahead had already been set long before she chose to walk it. She moved quickly after that, not because she felt ready, but because hesitation would only make it harder, gathering what little she could carry, a jacket for Sophie, a small bag with a few essentials, and the worn teddy bear that her daughter refused to sleep without. And when she gently woke her, Sophie stirred with confusion, her small voice asking where they were going. And Emily answered softly that they were taking a short trip, careful to keep her tone calm, because the last thing she wanted was for her daughter to feel the uncertainty she was trying to hold back. And within minutes, they were outside, the early morning air colder than she expected, the world still quiet, as if unaware that something significant was unfolding. And she secured Sophie in the back seat before getting into the driver's seat, her hands gripping the steering wheel as she took a breath that felt deeper than any she had taken that night. The road stretched out ahead of her, empty and dimly lit, the faint glow of streetlights giving way to darker stretches as she moved further from the city. And through it all, Richard remained on the line, his voice steady, guiding her with directions that seemed too precise to be improvised. And as the miles passed, the surroundings began to change, the buildings thinning out, replaced by long stretches of trees and quiet roads that twisted deeper into areas she had never driven through before. And despite the fear that lingered beneath the surface, there was also something else growing alongside it, a sense that whatever she was moving toward was not random, that there was a purpose to this journey that extended beyond the explanation she had been given. And she followed his instructions carefully, turning where he told her to turn, continuing forward even when the path became unfamiliar. By the time she reached the final stretch, the sky had begun to lighten slightly at the horizon, though the darkness still held most of the world in its quiet grip, and the road narrowed as it led toward a more isolated area, the kind of place that felt removed from everything else. And when Richard told her to stop, she did, pulling the car to the side as she looked ahead at what he had described, a small cabin set back from the road, its structure worn but standing, as if it had been left untouched for years. And for a moment, she didn't move, her eyes fixed on it as she tried to process the reality of what she had just done, that she had driven hours into the night, following the instructions of a man she had never met, all because of a phone call that was never meant for her. Richard's voice broke the silence, quieter now, almost reflective, as he told her that everything she needed was inside, that the envelope would be exactly where he had described, and that once she had it, she should leave immediately. And Emily nodded instinctively, even though he couldn't see her. Before stepping out of the car, the ground beneath her feet uneven, the air carrying a stillness that made every sound feel amplified. and she moved toward the cabin slowly, her senses heightened, her awareness sharp, because despite everything, she could not ignore the fact that she was alone in a place she did not know, following instructions that still had not been fully explained. The door creaked slightly as she pushed it open, revealing an interior that matched the outside, aged but intact, with dust settled across surfaces that had not been disturbed in years, and she stepped inside carefully, her eyes adjusting to the dim light as she looked around, taking in the details that felt both ordinary and significant at the same time. Because this was not just a place, it was part of something larger, something that had been waiting for this moment. And when Richard directed her toward the hearth, telling her to check beneath the floorboards, she knelt down, her hands brushing against the wood as she searched for the section he had described. And when she found it, loose just enough to be lifted, she hesitated for a brief second before pulling it up. Beneath it was a metal box, its surface worn with age, its weight heavier than she expected as she lifted it out and placed it on the floor in front of her. And for a moment, she simply stared at it, because this was the object that had set everything in motion, the reason she was here, the reason that call had mattered. And with a steadying breath, she opened it, revealing its contents, papers, letters, and at the center, a blue envelope that stood out immediately, its color faded but still distinct, and she reached for it carefully, her fingers brushing against its surface as she pulled it free. And as she did, something else shifted within the box, a photograph sliding slightly into view. She picked it up without thinking, her eyes drawn to the image, and the moment she saw it, everything around her seemed to fall away, because the face staring back at her was not unfamiliar, not distant, but deeply known, a woman she recognized instantly, not because she had seen this exact picture before, but because she had grown up seeing that face in different forms, in memories, in old belongings, in the reflection of herself. And her breath caught as she whispered a word she had not expected to say in that place, "Mom." And the realization that followed came with a force she was not prepared for, because this was not coincidence. This was connection. On the other end of the line, Richard's breathing changed, his composure slipping in a way that revealed something far more human than the controlled voice she had heard before. And when she described the photograph, his response was immediate, a quiet confirmation that carried decades of weight. And he began to speak, not with the authority he had started with, but with something closer to honesty, explaining that the woman in that photograph had been part of his life long before everything he had built, someone he had been forced to leave behind because of decisions that were made for him, decisions tied to family, to legacy, to expectations that had shaped the course of his future. And as he spoke, Emily listened, piecing together a story that connected her past to his in a way she had never considered. The envelope in her hands now felt different, no longer just an object tied to a task, but something that held answers. And when she opened it, she found documents that confirmed what she was beginning to understand, records that linked names, dates, and places in a way that formed a clear line between her mother and the life Richard had described. And the more she read, the more undeniable it became that this was not an accidental connection, that her presence in this moment was tied to something that had been set in motion long before she was born. And as the first light of morning began to filter through the windows of the cabin, she stepped outside, the envelope still in her hands, the world around her slowly coming into view with a clarity that matched the realization settling in her mind. Her phone vibrated, a notification appearing on the screen that she almost didn't notice at first, and when she looked at it, her breath caught again, because the number displayed was not just significant, it was life-changing, a transfer that ensured that everything she had feared losing just hours earlier was no longer at risk. And for a moment, she stood there, trying to reconcile the reality of what had just happened, that a single call, made in desperation, had led her to this place, to this discovery, to this connection, and to a future that looked entirely different from the one she had expected. Richard spoke again, his voice steadier now, but still carrying the weight of everything that had been revealed, telling her that he would arrange for her and Sophie to be brought to New York, not as part of a transaction, not as someone completing a task, but as family, as a connection that had been lost and now found again in a way neither of them could have predicted. And as Emily looked back toward the cabin, toward the place where the truth had been waiting, she understood that the life she had known was not erased, but it had been expanded, reshaped by something she could not have planned. And as she returned to the car, opening the door and looking at Sophie, who was just beginning to wake, she smiled in a way that felt different from anything she had felt before, because for the first time in a long time, the uncertainty she carried was no longer filled with fear, but with possibility. As the sun rose fully over the horizon, casting light across the quiet road, Emily started the engine, the sound steady and familiar, and she took one last look at the place that had changed everything before turning the car around, beginning the drive back, not to the life she had left, but to a new chapter that had been waiting to begin. And as she drove, one thought remained clear in her mind, that sometimes the moments we see as mistakes are not mistakes at all, but turning points, moments, where the path shifts in ways we could never predict. And that night, at exactly 3:14 in the morning, when she dialed a number she thought would lead to help, she had unknowingly connected to something far greater, something that had been waiting for years to find its way back, proving that even the smallest decisions can carry consequences that reach far beyond what we can see in the moment. Emily drove in silence for several miles, her hands steady on the wheel, but her mind moving through everything that had just happened, replaying each moment with a clarity that felt almost unreal, because just hours earlier she had been sitting in a dim apartment facing the loss of everything. And now she was carrying answers that reached far beyond her own life, answers that connected her to a past she had never fully understood. And as the road stretched ahead of her, she glanced in the rearview mirror at Sophie, who was now awake, quietly watching the world pass by with a calm curiosity that only a child could have. And Emily felt something shift within her, not relief exactly, but a quiet understanding that whatever came next, she would no longer be facing it alone or in the same way she had before. The drive back felt shorter, though nothing about it had changed physically, and as the morning continued to unfold, the world seemed more defined, more present, as if the uncertainty that had clouded everything before had begun to clear. And when she finally reached the edge of the town she had left behind, she slowed slightly, taking in the familiar streets that now felt different, not because they had changed, but because she had. And she realized that this place, which had once represented struggle and limitation, was now just one part of a much larger story, one that extended beyond what she had known. And she parked the car outside the apartment for a moment, not going inside immediately, but sitting there with the engine idling as she allowed herself to fully process the transition she had just made. Her phone buzzed again, this time not with a notification, but with a call, and when she answered, Richard's voice came through, more composed now, though still carrying a tone that reflected everything they had uncovered. And he spoke about the next steps, about arrangements that were already being made, about people who would reach out to ensure that everything moved forward smoothly. But what stood out most was not the logistics. It was the way he spoke to her, not as someone completing a task, but as someone he recognized, someone connected to him in a way that went beyond circumstance. And as he spoke, Emily listened, not with the uncertainty she had felt earlier, but with a growing sense that this was not just the end of one situation, but the beginning of something that would take time to fully understand. Over the next few days, the reality of what had happened began to settle into something more tangible, as the immediate concerns that had once defined her life were resolved in ways she could not have imagined. The eviction notice was no longer a threat. The financial strain that had weighed on every decision was replaced by stability. And yet, despite these changes, what remained most significant was not the money. It was the connection that had been uncovered, the understanding that her life was part of a larger narrative that had been shaped long before she was aware of it. And as she spoke with Richard again, this time not as a voice in the dark, but as someone actively present in her life, the distance between them began to close in a way that felt both unfamiliar and natural at the same time. When the day came for her to travel to New York, the experience was unlike anything she had known, not because of the luxury or the scale, but because of what it represented, a transition from one phase of her life to another. And as she arrived, stepping into a world that had once felt distant and inaccessible, she found that the reality of it was not defined by what she had imagined, but by the conversations that followed, the moments where questions were asked and answered, where pieces of the past were shared openly. and where the connection between them was explored not as something sudden, but as something that had always existed beneath the surface. Richard met her with a presence that matched the voice she had first heard, composed, deliberate, but now carrying an openness that had not been there before. And as they spoke, the details of the past were laid out more clearly, the decisions that had separated him from her mother, the efforts he had made to find her, and the barriers that had been placed in his way by those who had their own reasons for keeping that part of his life hidden. And Emily listened carefully, not accepting everything without question, but recognizing that the truth was often more complex than a single explanation, and that what mattered now was not just what had happened, but what would happen next. Sophie adjusted quickly, her natural curiosity and openness allowing her to move through the changes with a sense of ease that Emily both admired and relied on. And as the days turned into weeks, a new rhythm began to form, one that balanced the life she had known with the opportunities that had now become available. And through it all, Emily remained grounded in the understanding that while her circumstances had changed, the values that had guided her through the hardest moments of her life were still the same, and that the strength she had built during those years was not something to leave behind, but something to carry forward into whatever came next. In time, the story that had begun with a single phone call became something that extended beyond just her experience, drawing attention from others who saw it as an example of how unexpected moments can alter the course of a life. And while the details were shared in ways that captured interest and curiosity, what remained most meaningful to Emily was not the attention, but the quiet reality of what had been restored, the connection that had been found, and the understanding that even the most unlikely paths can lead to something real and lasting. And as she looked back on that night, on the moment she had dialed a number she believed would lead to help, she saw it not as a mistake, but as a point where everything had shifted. And as the years passed, that moment remained a part of her story, not as something that defined her entirely, but as something that reminded her of how quickly life can change, how connections can exist without being visible, and how sometimes the answers we are searching for are already closer than we realize, waiting for the right moment to be discovered. And in the end, what began as a desperate call for assistance became something far greater, a reminder that even in the most uncertain moments, there is always the possibility that something unexpected can lead to a new beginning, and that sometimes the path forward is not something we find, but something that finds us when we need it most. At exactly 3:14 in the morning, Emily Carter didn't make a life-changing decision. She made a desperate one. She wasn't chasing opportunity, she was trying to survive. And yet, that single moment, that one call, changed everything. Not because she planned it, not because she deserved it more than anyone else, but because sometimes life shifts in ways we don't see coming. So maybe the real question isn't what happened to her. Maybe it's this. If you found yourself in that same moment, with everything on the line and no clear way out, would you still make the call? Because sometimes, the smallest decision you make becomes the moment your life finally changes. Subscribe to Story Nest. I will see you in the next one.